right, welcome to another edition of our outreach live stream here at Calvary South Austin. Thank you guys for tuning in there on YouTube, or if you're on the Calvary South Austin webpage, we appreciate you logging on, checking us out. Tonight, we're going to have a great discussion on, it's called the use and abuse of science. And it's going to be a really good discussion, guys, and I'm hoping that you guys can learn a lot. And I just want to mention also that you can definitely share the link, the live stream link, wherever you're watching. There should be a share button when you hover over the video. There should be a way to share this on your social media platforms. We encourage you to do so. Just get as many people joining in on the conversation and on the discussion. Also, we're going to have a live Q&A after our discussion, so I definitely encourage you to jump on the YouTube live chat. We have somebody monitoring the chat, taking your questions, so start sending them in now, and we'll have a really good discussion time after this discussion. So share that link.
So a discussion after the discussion.
Yes, within a discussion, but
like
it happens
it's
before.
Like Inception.
Yes. There's the layer, guys, that we're not even considering, and it's beyond all knowledge. Well, share the link, invite people, engage in the live chat, send in your questions, guys. And also did want to mention for Calvary South Austin people, we have opened our doors back up. Thankfully, here in Texas, Travis County, we're able to open the doors of the church. We opened, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago already. And we have made the necessary changes, accommodations to, continue abiding by those safety protocols. So we're open, guys. We definitely encourage you, come on by and join us on Sunday mornings, 9:15 and 11:15 a.m., and on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. We'd love to see you here. Also, these outreach live streams are definitely open door as well. You can come on by and be part of the discussion as well. So with that said, guys, I want to get our discussion kicked off. As I mentioned, we're talking about the use and abuse of science. One more thing, I did want to introduce our other discussion partner here, which is our pastor, Bunjee Garrett. I have no jokes for him today. Sorry. I've already used them all up.
You're not going to tell me how smart I look in my NASA shirt?
Oh, yes. I couldn't see it because of that grangly beard, but sees quarantine has treated your hair well.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
that's good. So we're talking about, Bunjee, we're talking about the use and abuse of science. That's a funny way to put it. People these days, obviously, there's a lot of stock in science. People say science says, scientists say, the data shows. A lot of these types of phrases we hear thrown around today, right? So yes. it's almost turning into just a truism, right? You just got to believe the science. But, where I want to start off this discussion is, okay, I understand, we'll get to the scientific method, what it's about later, but I want to go a level deeper and just talk about the assumptions about the scientific method and about scientific exploration in general. So let's talk about what are some of the assumptions that go into that you basically can't do science without?
So basically, you want to talk about epistemology.
A piece of wood, huh?
A who's-he, what's-he? We want to get into, how do we know anything?
Is that epistemology?
Yeah. How do we, what is the basis of knowledge?
Yeah.
Right? And with that, we have to talk about logic. I've talked with a lot of unbelievers. I've talked with a lot of atheists, who will insist that Christians need to be logical in their beliefs. And I always agree, yes, of course, we need to be logical. We need to be rational. But then that brings up another question, which is, what is the basis for logic in a materialistic universe? Okay,
so before you carry on, get it? Epistemology, the philosophy of how we know things. Yep. Now, you mentioned a couple other words. So one of them was materialistic. Can you break that even down for our audience?
Sure. Materialism is basically the belief that there's only matter, right? That everything is just matter in motion. That there's nothing immaterial. There's no God. There's no spirits. There's no ghosts. There's no, everything is just matter, and that's the materialistic, worldview.
And everything can be explained by referencing matter, right?
Right. Exactly right. So therefore, we would have to assume then that, laws of logic, the laws that govern, reasonable thinking, are just chemical reactions in the brain then. But if the laws of logic are just chemical reactions happening in the brain and therefore material in nature, then we have to ask, well, why do we all strive to abide by the same laws? The chemical reactions in your brain aren't the same as the chemical reactions in my brain. If we go to, maybe a mental hospital where someone believes that they're Abraham Lincoln, how could we tell them that they aren't if that's what the chemical reactions in their brain is telling them, right?
Yeah.
So because we would look at someone who's saying, I'm Abraham Lincoln, and we would say, no, you're not. Well, based on what?
Your height. Can you recite the Gettysburg Address?
That's right.
Can you do any of those things now?
Yeah, so the laws of logic must be beyond the chemical reactions of the brain. There are laws of logic that govern, and help us to understand whether we're thinking rationally and reasonably or not. So when the atheist says the Christian needs to be logical, the Christian needs to be rational, I say, yes, of course, but can you, Mr. Atheist, explain how we have these universal laws of logic? They're universal because we recognize that logic, these laws of logic, which, just to break them down,
Sure,
it's simply put, if, then, either, or, neither, nor. Those are the three foundational laws of logic. There are some, fundamental principles under those laws that we don't necessarily need to get into tonight. But these three fundamental laws, if, then, either, or, neither, nor, or technically you could call them the law of identification, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. Mm-hmm. These are the three laws that govern rational thought. And it's so crucial for us to understand that the reason why these laws are universal in nature is because they've come from a lawgiver beyond our universe. That's why we have universal laws of thought. These universal laws of logic have been dialed into the creation. God has designed the universe in this way. God has given our minds that need to be logical and rational. When you tell someone, or expose someone as thinking irrationally, their mind starts working overtime to try to justify those thoughts or possibly give up those thoughts for more rational thinking.
Yeah.
So it's dialed into the way we are. Mm-hmm. And yet all of the chemical reactions in our brains aren't the same, so therefore it has to be beyond the brain itself.
So if I can break it down, right? Yep. So if I can just kind of condense what you're saying here is, number one, we're trying to show that, and I did mention this at the outset, but my apologies, but we're trying to show that science only makes sense with God. God must exist for science to even make sense and be possible, right? So what Bunjee, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying, so we're honing in on the laws of logic, and if materialism is true, if materialism is the name of the game, then how do you explain laws of logic at the outset, right? So it's assumed of everyone. We assume that everybody's operating on these same laws. We can't deny them, but yet we see that if materialism and evolution is the name of the game, we're supposed to be fizzing differently, right? I can't really assume what you're thinking, and I can't really make a judgment call or a value call on what you're thinking or believing, right? So how do we explain the laws of logic? But we see that the scientific exploration, scientific method is grounded in the laws of logic, right? So that's one way. Did you have anything else to add about laws of logic?
I would just say that in order for the scientific method to be properly used, we have to be rational and logical. Mm-hmm. Now, do we have a scientific explanation for where logic comes from and why? Why should we think rationally versus irrationally? Well, based on what?
Right.
If materialism is true and there's no ultimate standard for thought, why would I think, rationally over irrationally? What's the big deal, right? Mm-hmm. But we understand that it's better to think rationally, and this gives way towards scientific, research and understanding the universe, and so therefore, in order to engage in proper science, we have to first think rationally, and in order to think rationally, we must embrace the laws of logic, and yet the laws of logic, when you break down the underlying principles of logic, it points to a creator God.
Yep.
So this brings us around to the scientific method, which many scientists just leave God out at the outset. They begin with a materialistic point of view and then launch into their science from there. So they have a presupposition before the scientific research that God will never be the explanation for anything that they study.
Right.
And yet they're borrowing, they're smuggling
Exactly.
in the very logic that God gave them to do the science. So, materialistic science presupposes, something that's false.
Yep.
The very first presupposition that, God is not the explanation for anything, it's a false presupposition, which is going to give way, more than likely, to faulty science.
Yeah. False conclusions and whatnot.
Yep.
So laws of logic are one of the assumptions that ground scientific exploration that leads to, it points us in the direction that God exists, and it's that is a necessary assumption that we need. Also, there's another assumption that is needed in scientific exploration, which is the uniformity of nature. So uniformity of nature here, what we mean here is that the laws of physics that govern our universe today, we don't expect them to change. For the popular one is gravity, right? I can drop an object to the floor and I expect it to drop at a certain rate. We've seen this experiment going centuries back, right? But we don't expect that to change, and we don't expect that it's changed since the beginning of time. So there's a uniformity in nature that everybody's assuming, and that allows us to then make predictions about our hypotheses that we're testing, and allows us to make predictions based on our conclusions from a scientific experiment. So uniformity of nature is one of those assumptions. Now, how does that point us to God?
Well, going back to the idea that, if you don't start, if you're trying to smuggle in logic to do scientific research, but you leave God out of the equation, right, you're going to have bad science, right? And uniformity of nature is just one of those examples, right? So the theory of evolution, for example, is based on this belief that everything's always been changing, right? So, we talked about it at our last show, from goo to you by way of the zoo, right? So from dirt, to life, right? From the Big Bang to everything you see today, right? Well, that's not uniform.
Right.
There's nothing uniform about, a universe that pops into existence from nothing and then begins to change from non-life to living beings that we see today, right? And yet, all the scientific studies that they engage in is based on the belief that everything will continue as it always has, uniformity. Well, hold on. So what you're telling me is that you're measuring all these things that are uniform and consistent, and you're using that to tell me that everything's always been changing?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. It's not logical.
Right.
So if I can test, these, speed of light, if I can test, the decay process of, of carbon, if I can, and expect that all these things will continue tomorrow the same, and were in the past the same, if that's the case, then I have to assume these things have been designed to function in this way.
Yeah.
And so it brings me right back to God.
Yeah, even the constants that govern the existence of the universe and the way that the universe is working currently, right? These constants, they're constants in equations. We use them in equations, and they never change. There's something that you can just trust and assume that if I put this value for this constant that's governing this, physical limitation of the universe, that I'm going to get a certain value out at the end. And there's uniformity that is just presumed. It's assumed right at the outset, but yet we're just asking the question, how do you explain that uniformity if matter is all that exists? How do you explain that? And from a Christian standpoint, we're saying you must have God as the grounding for this feature of the universe, that we can expect uniformity. We can expect uniformity from the beginning of time all the way to present time, and we can even make predictive solutions going forward into the future based on this uniformity in nature.
That's why God says, come now, let's reason together. We have a God who says, I want to reason with you, and he's given us the tools to do it. So, I think the best science is going to begin with a belief in this God who is reasonable, and then we can start looking at his design. We can start looking at the universe that he created. We can start looking at the brain that he gave us, and properly understand things.
Most of us, makes sense. So that's really good. So audience, what we're telling you guys is that we're trying to show that science only makes sense, and science is only possible when we point to God, when we start with the assumption that God exists. He is the grounding for these assumptions that enable us to even do scientific exploration. So the first one that we talked about was laws of logic that must be in place. Remember, laws of logic are not material. They're not material things, and they're external, and they're eternal. So you can't have that in a materialistic universe. And then we talked about the uniformity of nature. Now, one last assumption that we're going to talk about here that grounds scientific exploration is the reasonableness of mathematics. Now, don't get scared, audience. Mathematics is probably the bane of everybody's existence out there, but we see a couple thumbs up here in the audience. And yes, it's true. But let's reason this through, right? Let's discuss this. Mathematics, obviously it plays a role in scientific exploration, but how does that point us to God?
Well, I know that 2 + 2 is not 5.
Well, for very large values of 2. What about that?
Oh. Math is definitely not my strong suit. I think I failed.
Do you have a strong suit?
Well, yes, I have a very strong suit.
Yes.
It's reinforced.
Nice.
But I failed out of intro to algebra twice.
Yeah.
As soon as they started introducing letters into the problems.
Alphabet.
Can you
I was
find
done
X?
with that.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah, it's right there.
There's X. I get math in the sense that I can look at it and grasp it, right? But to work out the equations, I really kind of struggle with.
Yeah.
But I do know that, logic gives way to math. And math just further reveals the order and complexity of a God who has designed things to work properly so that we can reason our way back to knowing who he is. But also practically, look at how much incredible, research has been done just using math. You can speak to that better than I.
Can I? I don't know. This is the way I think about math is, I heard it once described this way. Math is really just another language, right? And it's a way we think, but it's something that is just kind of built in to the universe. Everywhere we look, there's math that is all around us, from the construction of this building, even to the construction definitely of these powerful machines that we have here in front of us and these other gadgets that are all around us. A lot of math. It took us to the moon, it's taking us to all around the universe. Math is kind of built into the universe, but it's another language. And here, we point back to, it's similar to the laws of logic where these things are not material. These things are external to us. We didn't create math. We discover properties and we are able to organize our thoughts in a mathematical language, but we didn't create it. And so again, you have to ask the fundamental, foundational questions about these things, about laws of logic, uniformity of nature, and then mathematics is what grounds these things. And the best explanation is that God must exist. God is the grounding, and that enables us, again, to do scientific exploration. That's what makes most sense. And so math is as difficult as it is, but almost as simplistic as it is. You see some of the equations that are used in some of these really difficult experiments, and you see that there's really only about like E = mc squared, right? Everybody knows that trope. E = mc squared, one of Einstein's equations. But it really only has 3 variables in it, and it was reduced down to E, M, and C, the speed, and one of them's a constant, right? So you're really only dealing with 2 variables there. So there's this beauty in mathematics that really can't be accounted for materialistically. Materialism does not give you that understanding and that predictiveness that, I expect these things to really just line up beautifully into this simple equation at the end. And so you have to ask yourself, what does? God must exist. He is the grounding. We can expect beauty in nature. We can expect uniformity in nature, and we can expect a logical rationality in nature because God is the grounding of all this.
Yeah,
right?
We last talked about the Fibonacci sequence, which is a perfect example of this, where you see this mathematical equation worked out in much of the design of our universe, anything from galaxies to shells. You find the Fibonacci sequence, which mathematically is just adding this number to the last number and continuing in that process so that it creates this, wonderful spiral. And, clearly, that is God's thumbprint, on his creation, and math reveals that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, you hear a lot of people say, when they go out into a nice, beautiful forest, right? Or they see a landscape, mountainscape, and you're just in awe, right? There's something that is there. But when you break it down into these fundamental principles or fundamental, principles, and you see that how the math is working even in those things, something that seems just chaotic and random, but when you look at it a little deeper, you see that there's actually a pattern here, and you can actually solve for it. If you're really smart enough, you know all the equations and what to look for, you can actually solve for it. And using these beautifully laid out equations, there's something there that must be answered. And materialism, something that stems from atheism, is not going to give you that answer. It's not going to give you that assumption. But like Bunjee mentioned, is that what you have is atheistic scientists and materialistic scientists borrowing from the Christian worldview without even knowing it, right? Unknowingly, much of the time. So I don't think they could give, they don't really give too much attention to what assumptions am I making, but yet we know that they're borrowing from the Christian worldview in order to even do science at the outset. So that's something for you, audience, to point out. We want to help you have good conversations over these things. So one question to ask is, okay, explain these three assumptions that go into scientific exploration. Just to repeat them one more time: laws of logic, uniformity of nature, and the reasonableness of mathematics, right? So these will give you a good tool in your tool belt to ask those good questions to your scientific-minded friends or even scientists that you know. How do you explain these assumptions that go into the scientific method?
Yeah, we actually interviewed an atheist years ago on a show that I used to be on, and he was one of the atheists who encouraged me to be rational and reasonable and use laws of logic. And I asked him, "Can you justify laws of logic in a materialistic universe?" And he began to tell me that, well, the universe just works this way and this and that, right? And I said, so what you're saying is that logic, it's just that way. That's your only, and it is. When you look at a materialistic universe, there's no designer, right? So how is it that mathematics is possible? How is it that that nature is uniform? That there are these constants? How is it? Why isn't tomorrow going to be drastically different from yesterday? And why isn't it that a billion years ago was drastically different by way of like the elements and the physical laws? And why don't we assume that everything was just so much different a billion years ago? If everything's always been changing, then we couldn't know for certain that the elements back a billion years ago weren't the same as today, that the laws of physics were different back then as they are today. So, but all the research that we do is based on the belief that, well, it's always been running this way. It's always been working this way. These have always been the elements. These have always been the physical laws, right? Well, based on what do you believe that? They're smuggling in a belief in design while denying the designer.
Yep.
Yep.
Very good. Very well put.
That's why Marcelo Gleiser, this is a 60-year-old Brazil-born theoretical physicist at Dartmouth College, and he's the winner of the Templeton Prize. And this is what he said. This is an agnostic talking, right? And a prestigious scientist. He says, "I honestly think atheism is inconsistent with the scientific method." Boom.
Yeah, say that one more time.
Yeah, he says, "I honestly think atheism is inconsistent with the scientific method." This is an agnostic. Wow. He's an agnostic, right?
Yeah.
So he's saying, I don't know who God is, right? But he totally thinks that atheism is completely inconsistent with the scientific method.
Yep. Yeah, and so, I'm anticipating an objection that goes like this, and I've heard it before, where they say, well, if it's true that atheism is inconsistent with the scientific method, then why are the majority of scientists atheists or, some other variation of that? Why is that the case? I've heard this objection. Basically, they're trying to show you that atheism is actually what is running the scientific method, because you have so many scientists that are atheists, right? So you get the force of that question or that objection. And here's what I would say to that is, when somebody comes to you and say, well, why are so many scientists atheists? I would say, well, you have to understand what we're not saying. We're not saying that you have to believe in God in order to do science. What we are saying is that God must exist in order for science to even be possible. I hope you get the difference there. And I'll repeat it. We're not saying you have to believe in God in order to do science, because that is obviously true. That is why you can have a bunch of scientists that are atheists and they're doing scientific exploration. That's their belief that God doesn't exist. But we're asking a different question. We're actually making a different objection. We're saying God must exist in order for science to be even possible, right? So now they have to account for, why are you smuggling in principles from another worldview in order to even do science? That's where you would want to corner them and ask them that question. Okay, so hopefully, if you can anticipate that objection and you can answer them in that way, saying God must exist. We're not talking about your beliefs. We're talking about what actually is the case. God must exist for science to be even possible.
It's also important to realize that the atheistic scientists today are standing on the shoulders of a whole lot of Christians who founded many of the scientific disciplines, I should say. You know, we certainly see, when you look at the foundations of founding fathers of science, I should say, you have Leonardo Da Vinci, and I think that when you look at, his disciplines of mathematics, architecture, painting, engineering, geology, anatomy, here's this guy who, believed in God and believed, that he was studying God's design, right? You also have Copernicus, who, worked in mathematics and astronomy and economics and medicine. But my favorite, you can guess which is my favorite.
I'm going to say Sir Roger Francis Bacon.
That's right.
There we go.
Francis Bacon is everyone's favorite.
Thick cut.
Especially for breakfast. When I study science in the morning, I study Francis Bacon.
An ode to bacon.
But, Francis Bacon is, given the honor of being the inventor of the scientific method. Not to say that, there was no science before
it had to go
him,
to somebody.
right?
Yeah. Might as well give it to Bacon.
Yeah. But, here's this Christian,
Yep.
He was an Anglican and, is basically the father of the scientific method.
Yeah.
So now you have all these atheists not only smuggling in logic and uniformity and mathematics into their science, but they're actually employing a method that was invented by a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm actually honing in on the time frame that you're talking about, that era in time, which is around the Renaissance era, and that's really where the scientific revolution occurred. That's when you just had this gate burst open of scientific exploration. Now we started discovering a whole bunch of things, and as Bunjee mentioned, now you started having the creation of a bunch of scientific disciplines at that time. Scientific revolution is what we know. Some of you guys may have, you may remember learning about this in history class. But now the question is, why did that happen at that specific time and with those specific scientists? Some of the other scientists that, Bunjee mentioned Copernicus, Bacon, there's Galileo, there's probably another one of everybody's favorite is Isaac Newton.
Here's what Isaac Newton said.
Oh, yeah.
Isaac Newton said, opposite to godliness is atheism in profession and idolatry in practice. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind that it never had many professors. Atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance. Here's one of the greatest scientists ever.
Yeah.
I mean, he is. He's one of the greatest scientists ever.
I had his jersey. Yep.
And he, clearly was a believer.
Oh, yeah. I did hear it once. I don't know if it was by Isaac Newton's own admission, but it was said that, Newton was more of a theologian than he was a scientist. Right. And that's saying something.
He had some strange theology.
Yeah, he does have strange theology.
but yes.
Yeah, it definitely informed his and motivated his scientific exploration. It motivated what experiments he should be doing, what he should be looking into, right? So we have Isaac Newton, there's Boyle, there's Pascal, there's Leibniz. My favorite, and probably not favorite, is James Clerk Maxwell, somebody I learned about in college. Couldn't get his equations. There's only 4 of them. But anyways, all these guys, devout believers. Christians through and through. And all around the same time period and extending forward into in that era, it was known as the scientific revolution. And there's a bunch of books written on this, but understanding that Christian framework of thinking, the Christian way of thinking, Christian worldview is what grounded the scientific revolution. It is what enabled these great men of past and women to go forward and start discovering things throughout the world. And now we're starting to discover things in the universe. But again, it was that Christian framework. Remember, in that era, you had the entire globe. Why is it the case that you didn't have Islamic scholars, you didn't have Far Eastern scholars, you didn't have other people around the globe really ushering in the scientific revolution? Why was it in this time frame and these specific people with this specific worldview, which is a Christian worldview, why is it that the scientific revolution came from them? And it makes sense because of when they're reading the Bible, and we'll get to some of the verses later on today, is when they read the Bible, they understood that God exists and that they can expect uniformity in nature. They can expect rationality, and that enables them to go out and say, I can expect certain things, and I can go and discover a whole bunch of things. So scientific revolution, for those of you that are interested, definitely look up some of these scientists that we talked about and see how it is that their belief in God motivated them to do science. So that's a really good point that you bring up, and that was a really great quote from Isaac Newton. Trigger warning, by the way. He probably would not be invited to any college campuses, that's for sure. So
that's good.
Closing out this first section, guys, about science only makes sense, and it's only possible when God exists, right? So hopefully that gives you some good tools in your tool belt, again, to have those good conversations, ask those good questions, and then bring up these assumptions, bring up these underlying foundational assumptions that go into the scientific method and scientific exploration, and then some of the scientists that ushered in the scientific revolution. Why was it them with that Christian worldview? And I like the way Bunjee put it. So think about this. Not only do you have the atheistic scientist who is borrowing from another worldview, but they're doing that while also standing on the shoulders of these great scientists, Christian scientists, who had the Christian framework to usher in the scientific revolution. So they're standing on the shoulders, but they're also borrowing. So you got to wonder, how can they actually justify doing good science based on materialism? You can't do it. You just cannot do it. So that closes out our first section. I just want to remind you guys that are viewing on YouTube, we got a live chat going. Engage on the live chat. Ask your questions, because we're going to have a live Q&A discussion after this. Send in your questions. Honestly, it doesn't have to be pertaining to science. It'd be awesome to stick to science, but if you got other questions on your mind, feel free to ask them. We'll try our best to answer them. Share the link to this live stream on whatever social media platform you're on. We'd love to get other people in on the discussion. And also, I did want to remind all those people that come to Calvary South Austin, remind you that the doors are open. We're having services face-to-face, fellowship here, Sunday mornings, 9:15 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. 2 services for you guys on Sundays, and on Wednesday evenings, just like we used to have it. This is nothing new. It's like we used to have it Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. We invite you to come on over. Texas is starting to open back up, but we've also made the necessary accommodations, and we're taking the necessary precautions to keep everybody safe while we're doing so in this weird and crazy time, right? But we invite you to come on out. So let's jump into our next section here, Bunjee, and we're asking the question. So, underlying assumptions, that's a cool discussion. But now, what is science even good for, right? Some people out there might not have gotten a degree in science, or really they're just not scientifically minded. So we ask the question, what is science even good for?
Yeah, wasn't it Whitney Houston who asked, "What's science got to do with it?"
Mm-hmm.
No,
it's a secondhand occupation. Is that what it is?
I think I got that wrong.
Yeah. Can you sing it in that on that register?
So science has really kind of, and please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, because I'm fully for the scientific method. I believe that science is a wonderful tool, that we should use it for everything that it's worth, and it's worth a lot.
And yet you're going to have people that misunderstand you.
Well, yes, of course, people are going to misunderstand me. That's a weekly thing for me, but daily, according to some. But so it's not that I just want to shoot down, the scientific method, right? The whole discussion here is called the use and abuse,
Right?
And it's sad that the abuse of science has really taken root, and it's almost like there are people who have embraced scientism as a religion. Right.
Explain scientism.
Just the idea that the scientist is the priest of my religious system now, and whatever science says, I believe. So basically, someone just had to say, well, science says this, therefore, science says. I think there was a sign in a bunch of yards, a couple last year, I think it was.
I've seen some of those. Yep.
And I think one of the phrases, we believe in science.
There you go.
It's like, well, who doesn't believe in science these days? We see them attacking the president, whether you like Trump or not, is irrelevant. But they're constantly attacking him as being someone who rejects the science. And yet, every time I see him, on TV now, he's up there with a couple of doctors, right, talking science, right? So, does he say silly things that can be
misunderstood
or misapplied? Yeah, of course. Is he a scientist? I don't think so. But he is leaning on the scientists, but that is one of those, talking points, one of those attacks, that, he doesn't agree with science. I don't think there's anybody, in America today who's like, I hate science, I'm against science. The question is, what science and which scientists are we actually listening to? Mm-hmm. I remember debating someone at University of Texas, and he said, have you taken a college level biology course? Well,
it's very specific.
It's even just a loaded question.
Exactly.
And I asked, I said, sir, do you mean to tell me that everyone who takes a college level biology course becomes an evolutionist? Because I can give you a long list of very studied people, people who have taken well beyond a college level biology course and are Bible believing Christians, right? Yeah. So his mentality though was, if everybody would just take a college level biology course, then you'll automatically become a materialist and an atheist. It's like no. So science says is such a loaded statement.
Yeah.
Right, because there are scientists who, all the scientists are looking at the same information, right? The creationists and the evolutionists, the believers and the non-believers, they're all looking at the same data, but they're walking away with different conclusions,
right?
Scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
So when science says something, which science never says anything, scientists say things.
Yep.
And scientists are typically dialing in their belief system to the science that they're promoting. And I know that's true because the same, two different groups of scientists can look at the same data and walk away with different conclusions.
So then is this just a lost cause? What can we use science for then?
No, I'm not saying it's a lost cause, but one of the things that I always like to say is that the science is only as good as the scientist. And the scientist is only as good as their ability to set aside presuppositions as best as possible. We all have presuppositions.
Yep.
You want to define presupposition?
I presuppose something. Is that a good definition?
I presuppose you know the definition of presupposition.
Yeah, it's the idea of presupposing. No, when you make certain assumptions, right, at the outset. So when it's like when when somebody says something to you and you take it wrongly, you misinterpret it. You were basically presupposing. Let's say you're having a bad day and you're just already thinking, when somebody talks to me, I'm just going to assume that they're insulting me or something. You're already presupposing. You're assuming right before anything happens what your mentality is going to be. And so when it happens in science. And this happens in any discipline. We all have our biases. We all have our presuppositions, our assumptions.
It's a preloaded assumption.
Yeah, it's loaded into now my method of doing science. One of the presuppositions you brought up was when you presume that God cannot be an answer, cannot be an explanation for anything. That's going to affect your method. That's going to affect the way you do science, right?
When atheism is presupposed at the outset of your research, it affects the way you do your research. And, so, yeah, there's a lot of science that is, based on presuppositions. A lot of dating methods are based on some presuppositions. A lot of different research groups, have a presupposed, philosophy, in the way they go about doing things, right? Yeah. And not only that, though, it's also important to understand that science can't answer every question.
Right.
That is one of the presuppositions.
Now, that's kind of controversial to say.
Right.
In this day and age, right?
Yeah.
In the day and age of science says, and there's a study that we can all point to prove anything, that is a controversial statement. Say it again, that science cannot...
Science can't answer every question.
Okay. So I want to make sure.
Yeah, most certainly. It certainly can't. Science can't answer the question, did George Washington cross the Delaware?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it can't.
Interesting.
Science can't answer the question, did Jesus Christ rise from the grave?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, science can say people don't normally rise up from the grave.
Right.
Right? We can make that scientific statement, right? But we also know that miracles are possible. Even the atheist has to agree that miracles are possible.
Yeah.
Right? Because the atheist believes that nothing blew up and became everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's a miracle. So if that one miracle is possible, why not other miracles, like someone rising from the grave? Doesn't normally happen. That's why it's a miracle. That's why it's supernatural, not just natural, right? But science can't answer that question. Science can't really deal with, technically, we can't study the origin of the universe.
Yeah, because, again, scientific method, let's explain this.
Let's define the scientific method.
Right. And that's something, so that's good. So scientific method, guys, when you were in elementary or possibly a middle school, when they had you do a science experiment and there were certain things that you had to make sure to put on your little trifold board. I did not like this process at all, but you started off with a hypothesis, an observation of some sort, and you try to make a prediction about it. I think if I put, I don't know, some material in this fluid or this chemical, that this is going to be the outcome. That was your hypothesis. And then you made an observation. Then you started doing repetitive experiments. So it's based on repetition as well. Not to mention uniformity. But repetition, so you repeated certain experiments, changing a variable here and a variable there. And you basically took enough samples, and at the end of this scientific experiment based on observation and repetition, you could draw a conclusion, a reasonable conclusion based on what you tested. And so, yes, scientific method is based on observation and repetition, right?
Yep, which then leads to conclusions and predictions.
Right.
So,
but when we're talking about...
With that, we're talking about the origin, the beginning of the universe. Mm-hmm. Who was there to observe it? Who can repeat it? Right?
Are you going to mention Tom's name here?
Well, no.
No? Okay.
No, I wasn't.
Sorry, Tom.
But so I realize that we can forensically, look at the after effects and then try to make some, scientific observations based on that, mm-hmm. right? But,
sure.
But still, if you can't observe the beginning of the universe and you can't repeat it, then it's sort of beyond the realm of science, mm-hmm. right? Science can't answer every question. The scientific method can't be applied to every problem. For example, I brought it up at our last show, which Dr. Greg Bonson's, box of crackers in the pantry fallacy, right? Science can answer the question, is there a box of crackers in the pantry? What do? You go open the pantry door, you look inside, either there's a box of crackers there or there's not, right? Science can't answer the question, was there a box of crackers in the pantry?
Or why is there?
Or why,
yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of questions that science can't answer. So to treat science as like, this provides us with all information necessary. No. Again, there's those three spheres of knowledge. There are the known knows, there are the known unknowns, and there are the unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
And science can't address the unknown unknowns, because how do you observe an unknown unknown?
Exactly, right?
Yeah. So, science is a wonderful tool.
Yes, of course.
But it has limitations. And as a result, we have what I call the junkyard of science. Observation and research that led to theories that have since been disproved. And that's a wonderful thing about science, is that it's self-correcting, right? Mm-hmm. Given enough time, and if we have honest scientists, then there will be a self-correcting nature to theories along the way, and even with some ideas being tossed out because it's just shown to be false,
right?
Over and over, repeatedly, right? But the junkyard of science is full, and that's one thing that we have to understand, is that the people who are putting their faith in science are failing to recognize that if you apply the scientific method to the scientific method, then you discover that the scientific method is highly unreliable. Does that make sense?
I mean, a little bit, yeah. So let's try to break it down for the audience then. So scientific method, what we're basically trying to show you guys is that overall, science or the scientific method is not the end-all be-all of attaining knowledge, right? That was a scientism that Bunjee's talking about, is where you do have people today, because of their materialistic assumptions, their materialistic worldview, they assume that everything is material and everything can be explained by referencing material things, okay? But with the scientific method, you come across certain problems. It cannot answer every single question in the universe, right? And so some of the questions that Bunjee brought up, for sure, are really good ones. Origin science, so you have to apply different principles there. There's no repetition going on there. There was no observation. One of my favorite examples that I like bringing up is, science can let you know how someone died, but it can't let you know if that death was murder or not. Was it moral? So those moral questions, can't answer them. So think of like when during World War II, right? There was a lot of scientific experimentation going on from the Nazis towards the Jews, and they just used them as physical things, right? And so they performed scientific experiments, but science cannot tell you whether those experiments were moral or not. Yeah. So that's another thing that science cannot answer, or scientific method. So all that to say, guys, is that, again, when he says, when you apply that principle of scientific method to itself, you're not going to get anywhere quickly. Scientific method it cannot be reliable for everything in the universe. You have to use different tools. You have to use different epistemologies, the ways of knowing, different ways of attaining knowledge, not just a scientific method. Okay.
Yeah, and so the thing that I would just point out is that if you apply the scientific method to the scientific method, and you see how often the scientific method then is wrong, right? So observation and repeatability, when we look at all the times that the scientific method has led to faulty conclusions and false predictions, we see that the scientific method, as a beautiful tool as it is oftentimes wrong. Therefore, the scientific conclusions that we have arrived at today, we shouldn't expect that they're not going to be disproved tomorrow.
Right.
So to think that we've arrived at this place where we can say, okay, we've arrived at knowledge now that'll never be challenged by anything that we'll discover in the future. Well, the history of the scientific method has already proven that false.
Hence the junkyard.
Hence the junkyard, right? Spontaneous generation. They used to think that maggots just spontaneously generated from rotten meat.
So they would lay out some meat and then come back the next day and say, oh, there's maggots here.
Maggots.
Eating it, right? Yeah. Spontaneously
Those
generated.
maggots spontaneously generated from the rotten meat. That's what they believed.
It was held.
And,
it was a belief that
was a belief that was held in the scientific community, right? And then some research was done, and they, put, some meat in an open jar, some meat in a jar with cheesecloth over the top, and then meat with a closed jar, and then no maggots appeared in the closed jar. Some maggots with the jar with the cheesecloth on top, right? There were maggots inside, but also on top of the cheesecloth. Yep. So flies have been laying eggs on top of the cheesecloth, and some drop through, right? Sure. And then maggots in the open one, of course, right? So then they realized that, if it's closed system, then you don't have spontaneous generation, and therefore it was eventually dismissed, right?
Yep.
What about?
So that went to the junkyard.
That's in the junkyard, right? Luminiferous ether.
Repeat that because I don't know what you just said.
Luminiferous ether. This is when people were trying to figure out how the planets hung in space, and when,
Okay, I thought that was a spell you were casting. I don't know.
How does light travel? How does sound travel? And they believed in luminiferous ether as being the fabric of space and whatnot. And that's been that's gone now. It's in the junkyard.
Yeah.
Phlogiston.
Phlegm?
Yeah.
What? I believe in phlegm, yeah.
Phlogiston was believed to be what caused fire combustion.
Okay.
It's in the junkyard, right?
Right.
Steady state universe.
Yes. Now that's one I'm familiar with.
That's one you're familiar with, right? And that's one that is in the junkyard.
Yeah.
It's not a steady state, universe. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Your favorite.
Yes. 3 difficult words. I encourage you guys, please train saying these things when you're talking about them in conversation. You don't want to get tongue-tied.
I can't say oneissimus, but
Yes.
but I can say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Say vehemently,
this was the belief that the fetus in the womb went through all the stages of evolution, and basically went through the stages. It was the bird, and then it was the dinosaur.
You could see all the stages of evolution,
and they believed that the fetus in the womb of the mother would go through all the stages of basically phylogeny.
Yeah.
In the womb before it became human.
Yeah.
That was scientific,
and that was in textbooks.
That was in textbooks. That was science. Right. And now we know that's not the case, right?
And we know more about embryonic development.
Yes.
Yeah. So this junkyard of science is
full.
From the centuries, from scientific exploration, is more than full. It's probably overflowing, right?
It's overflowing.
Bloodletting's one of them, as I remember.
Yes.
You have a headache? Oh, man, I don't want to tell anybody I have a headache because I'm going to die.
Was it George Washington that died from bloodletting?
Oh, I don't know.
I think so.
That's sad. So that's pretty recent now, right? So a lot of, and again, we want to clarify, we're Christians. We're not bashing scientific method. Nope. What we're making a distinction is that scientific method is good for certain kinds of questions, but also it's only as good as the assumptions that you bake into your method. All right. So we're making very specific distinctions here. But then also when you look throughout history, for those people who want to say, no, science is the name of the game. This is the only way that I can attain knowledge, and whatever scientific report comes out, that's what I'm going to believe. For those types of people, you can show them the junkyard of science. Why is it that they would want to hold on to certain conclusions so tightly and say, this will never change? When the person starts saying things like, well, science says, and also, well, the science is settled. Those types of statements let you know, oh, this is the person I'm dealing with. Then you can enlighten them with the junkyard of science and say, look, people have been using the scientific method and coming up with some pretty poor conclusions throughout history. And so I think we need to expect, at the very least, just a little humility about the conclusions that are being drawn, saying, I'm open to them changing in the future, but we must answer a deeper question, which is, again, what grounding the scientific method? And that's where you can point to God, right? So again, as Christians, we're saying scientific method is a beautiful thing, but you have to understand what makes science go. What makes science science, what makes it beautiful is that you have certain assumptions, but also it is scientists that are interpreting the data, okay?
And then that brings us to hypothesis bias, right? Because a lot of scientists get caught up in their biases, and it skews the research, and as a result, they come up with faulty conclusions and bogus predictions, because they were biased to the hypotheses, or they were enticed with financial reward, or whatever the case is, right? I don't mean that this is true of every scientist, but there are those out there who are skewing the research, for their own personal gain.
Yeah.
And we have to just be careful, because when I was a kid, I was told that we were headed for an ice age, and now we're being told that it's the globe is going to heat up so much that we can't survive. So well, hold on a second. How did we go from an ice age to global warming in within my lifetime? Well, the science is skewed, right? How do we have the Imperial College telling us that there's going to be more than 2 million, people dying from coronavirus, and it hasn't even come close to those numbers. Every death has been tragic, and my heart breaks for the families who are suffering. But 2.2 million, it was a scientific model that was completely wrong.
Yeah, you bring a really good point, because I actually just read an article on that model that was used from that scientists in Imperial College, which, again, this goes back to what were the assumptions that were made going into this model. Number one, he just made poor assumptions about the rate of spreading and what the population sizes were, but also I believe there was an effect of randomness built into this software program that he was using to build the model, and it was just not correctly accounting for. Basically, it was making random predictions. It wasn't really making a justified prediction. And so again, this just points to the assumptions. Whatever assumptions you bake in at the outset, that is going to guide your method, and ultimately it's going to guide the result that you come out with in the end. And in here, we're talking about scientific experiments that have real world consequences. And so this is where we get into a really dicey territory of, no, we need to be humble about scientific predictions, because a lot of them do have real world consequences. So even as Christians, guys, we, there is science that we can trust, but then there's scientific results that we just need to kind of hold at arm's length and say, you know what? It sounds like it agrees with my bias a lot of the times, but I'm going to hold it at arm's length and just wait a little bit more and see what more experimentation is done, which is okay. We don't have to have the answer to everything at every single point in time. We don't have to have the hammer to bring down on anybody who tries to bring an objection. Sometimes it's okay to say, the jury's out on this one, But just so you know, assumptions going in at the outset are going to affect the outcome for sure. Also, so we talk about being humble with scientific conclusions. This isn't something else that you guys, we're letting you guys know how can we think critically. When somebody says science says, or the science is settled, one of them is definitely be humble about certain conclusions. And another one is, ask that friend that you're talking to, that you're in conversation with, ask them for evidence. When they say, well, don't you know that science says this, or the science is settled on this? A real reasonable response to that would just be, show me the evidence. If you're not familiar with the evidence, then it's entirely reasonable that you say, okay, well, show me the report, show me the study, and I got to do some homework on my own. I'll take it home and I'll read on it, and I'll draw my own conclusions from that. I think that's totally reasonable.
Most certainly, yeah. I don't think anybody should think that there's not room for us to learn and to continue to explore and take in new information. I think that we should all be open to that. So therefore, when somebody says the science is settled, the only time that really is true is when we're talking about like a law. Like a law of science is settled science. Right. Most things aren't laws, though. For something to become a scientific law, that there's a lot that goes into that, right? So a lot of times when somebody says the science is settled, they're not talking about something that is now scientific law, but something that the consensus has agreed with. Mm-hmm. Well, the scientific method is not to settle things, but to continue to observe, right? Science isn't attempting to make truth claims. It's attempting to continue to observe, and then if we observe something enough times and it's, clear that it's just always going to be that way, then, something becomes a law. But, the person who says that the science is settled, like dealing with abortion, right? Yeah. I've had people, as I've attempted to argue with them about, taking on a pro-life stance, they're just like, I don't even know what you're arguing about. The science is settled on this. What science? what was settled? Yeah. Right? So, yeah, the statement that science is settled, comes out of the mouth of the person who really just doesn't want to hear your point of view. Yeah, and that's true, guys. These are some good tips for you guys to use in your conversation, So number one, just be humble with the scientific conclusions. Ask for evidence, entirely reasonable to do that. Be open to having your mind change on certain things. And also ask yourself internally, when somebody's trying to explain to you, a certain scientific experiment and then the conclusion that results from that,
in your head while you're hearing this, ask does the conclusion really follow from the evidence that they're showing? And I think this does take practice, because you would really have to know specifically what questions to ask. But one question to ask is, are they trying to draw a moral conclusion from this scientific experiment? Mm-hmm. Right? Are they trying to draw an is from an ought from an is? Right? So one of them is definitely on like homosexuality, right? Where they say, another trope that I've heard is, well, we see homosexuality in the animal kingdom, therefore it is something that is natural. But then they go further and they say, therefore it is something that is good. So we see it in nature in the animal kingdom, and therefore we should assume then that it is something that we should abide by. And not only that, but it's a positive thing in our society. And as controversial as it is, I understand, but we have to learn to ask critical questions. One of them being, number one, can we actually make that connection that we are just like the animals in the animal kingdom? That's one good question to ask. So what conclusion are they trying to draw here? Well, one question to ask, are we actually like the animal kingdom? But then also, just because I see something in nature, does then that mean that I have to mimic it in real life?
I've seen lions hunting gazelles and devouring them raw. So if the animal kingdom is fine with murder, I've never seen a lion on trial at a gazelle court, and thrown in prison for, being a gazelle murderer, right? Well, we see that happening in the animal kingdom. So why isn't murder okay in our society? Why isn't it a good thing?
Yeah. Only cheetahs, because they're cheetahs.
And because they're cheesy.
Yeah. Nice. So, I also think about like all the kinds of different animals where it is the female that consumes the male after reproducing, right?
Yeah.
Is this going to be a common thing in society now? So
is this a good thing for the human race?
Is this a good thing, right? Now, I know probably some feminists would agree with that, but
third wave feminists.
Yeah, third wave feminists, yes. But what we're pointing here is that, it's very convenient when this type of person, the science settled person that wants to point to nature in specific instances, but yet when you would bring up these other cases where it's probably not a good idea, more than likely they would balk at that. They would object to it and say, well, okay, these specific instances are different because, that kind of thing. But that's not true. We're just following their way of thinking to its logical conclusion, right? Another thing that you can think critically on when somebody says science says is the difference between correlation and causation. Sure. So some other difficult words here. So correlation and causation. Causation, guys, I think everybody's familiar with is when something directly causes something else. So the fact that it's raining and I'm wet that's a direct causation. I'm wet because the rain is on my skin, right? I think we are easily able to identify causation. Correlation is a little different. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but correlation is when you see certain patterns. Like if you see your graph, every time this certain event happens, this other event seems to kind of follow in the same trajectory. You can't necessarily say the one thing causes the other, but you can safely say there's a tight correlation. They're tightly correlated, meaning I can mostly expect when this happens, this other thing is going to happen, but I just can't say at this point that it's directly causing that.
You can go back to the spontaneous generation research, right? So putting out meat, on your table, there's a correlation to the maggots, not a causation for the maggots, right?
Yeah, the meat is not.
The meat is not, spontaneously generating maggots. Mm-hmm. So it's not a causation, but it is a correlation because flies are going to come and land on the meat and have a little lunch and, leave a couple of eggs and take off. And, there's going to be maggots left behind, right? So there's a correlation, not a causation.
Exactly. Good example. So, learning to tell the difference between correlation and causation. So usually when somebody is bringing up this study that proves another good one that I think about, but it's another controversial one, is where they look into the happiness factor of certain relationships, one of them being homosexual versus heterosexual. And there's definitely several studies out there that show the happiness within couples that are homosexual is, or kids from a homosexual relationship, that they're much happier having homosexual parents versus a heterosexual couple having kids. What's the happiness factor there, right? But again, these are, when you look into the way the study is set up, you're not seeing direct causation because there's so many other elements that can be brought into to show that where's the happiness factor coming from.
Right.
They're actually just narrowing the scope so tightly that they're actually getting the results that they want. And so there's a correlation, but it definitely does not prove causation at that moment. There's just so many other factors that you have to think about. We talked about assumptions that are at the outset. Start learning to ask, what assumptions are people making when they're showing me a study that proves something? What are the assumptions that are coming through at the outset of this certain scientific experiment? And that'll definitely lead you on a good direction of, can I trust this result or not? Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else about how to think critically when somebody says science says?
Well, I've got a lot to say. For me, it really comes down to, what is this person attempting to convince me of? Is there more to this research than just, hey, I discovered something interesting, right? Or here's something that could make our life better, or here's something, right? Is there a political, bent to this? Is there a political reason for why, right, the science is going in this direction or focused on this very thing, right? A lot of times what we see happening is, we see industry and we see politics manipulating science to their end. And so that's one of the things that I want to know. And that kind of gets into assumption, but it's almost kind of like the opposite side. So there's an assumption at the beginning to a conclusion or an end game to get into the Marvel universe. They're trying to drive society in a certain direction.
Sure.
And we see that. We see that, with sexual revolution stuff and the science surrounding that. Like I remember back in, I think it was the 90s when, all the magazines produced an article about the gay gene. There's a gay gene, right? And the problem, though, with the science was that there was only one scientist that was able to find this gay gene. And no scientist was able to repeat what this one had observed. So it wasn't repeatable. No scientist could confirm it, right? And the scientist who found the gay gene was a homosexual.
Yeah.
Right? And yet all the major magazines and all the major, MSM, mainstream media, jumped all over the story. I mean, just put it out there like, this is fact. This is science. Science is settled, right? Based on one scientist's research who was biased.
And it couldn't be reproduced.
Why? Why are they wanting to push the story? And the reason why is because there's a greater narrative that they wanted to force upon, our society. Yeah. So perfect example of, one person found one thing, observed one little detail that they concluded was a gay gene. It wasn't corroborated by any other scientist, and yet the media was all over it because it fit the narrative.
Yeah. Yes, I think, just having a healthy skepticism, definitely. When usually I think we can trust our gut when something smells fishy or something's just off, right? Especially when it comes to a lot of these scientific studies, right? I guarantee you there is a study that shows contradictory conclusions. When you look at the journals, there will be studies that prove anything and everything.
Right.
These days, yes. And a lot of it does go to motivations, assumptions at the outset, that kind of stuff. So, we just want to encourage you guys to just have a healthy skepticism, healthy being the key word there, healthy skepticism of when somebody comes to you with a scientific study. I think the most reasonable thing to do at that point is just, if you're not familiar with any of the information, is just say, ask for the evidence and just be humble about the conclusions that could be drawn from that. And I think as Christians, definitely, and I think this is probably where we want to segue into, as Christians, guys, the Bible, the Word of God is our authority in the end. The Word of God is what we're going to look for for our faith, for our commitment to how do we look at the world? How do we understand this world? And so when we understand what the Word of God says about the way the world works, then we can go and interpret and view through the lens of the Word of God, how do we interpret the data that is coming to me from these scientific experiments, okay? So I know, Bunjee, you had a few passages.
Well, I think, it's a good point that the Word of God is our authority, and I think we need to really embrace that because there are so many things, beyond our scope that God has answered for us, like the creation account. There was no scientist there to observe it. There's no scientist today that can repeat it. And so in many ways it falls beyond the view of science, right? So thankfully we have the Creator God who tells us, hey, I created the universe, 6 days I created, seventh day I'd rested. I'm going to take his word for it. He's the one who was there. He's the one who knows. And thankfully he's told us, how many genders are there? And not that I have a hatred towards anybody, the Lord has given me a love for every single person. Yet when I go to the scriptures to look for, an authoritative standard on genders, what I find is God created male and female. I see two genders in the Bible, not more than that, right? The God of the Bible tells us, come and reason with me. Mm-hmm. And the end of that verse in Isaiah is about how our sins will be washed if we would come and reason with him. If we'll come and reason together with the Lord, then he will lead us to understand our great need for Jesus Christ so that we can be saved. The God of the Bible has revealed the spherical nature of the earth, years and years before, they did the math and figured it out. The Lord tells us in Isaiah that the earth is spherical and that the heavens are expanding like a curtain. You see, very incredible scientific statements all throughout the Word of God. And I encourage you, read Job 38 for homework, because there God comes before Job. Job's got all these questions about why God allowed these bad things to happen to him. And what a great opportunity for us to recognize that, bad things happened to Job and he didn't understand why, and he had questions. And why God, are you allowing bad things to happen to me? I was a good guy, right? And God comes along and just says, so you're going to get tripped up in your relationship with me because you don't have an answer to one question about why I allowed something bad to happen to you. Mm-hmm. Let me present you with a bunch of other questions that you can't answer today, and yet it didn't stop you from trusting in me. And then God in Job 38 launches into this, series of questions about, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. What were its foundations fastened? He's asking a question about gravity there. When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy, who shut in the sea with doors? And just on the questions go, which are all really scientific questions. And so God is challenging Job to be a scientist and to consider the creation, which, according to Isaiah declares, the psalmist David, he tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. So God provides us with this incredible creation, the creature, the creation that he's made, and all of it is designed to reveal his handiwork and show us his glory. And so I encourage people, be a scientist. Observe everything around you. Engage in experiment. Have a hypothesis. Make predictions. Just engage in the scientific method. And if you do it honestly, it'll bring you to a recognition that our God is incredible. Mm-hmm. He's designed the universe. He's given us order. He's given us uniformity. And he's given us a way to know him by observing his creation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Those Bible passages, by the way, Job 38, very thick with sarcasm from God's end. When you read it, man, you start feeling bad for Job. Like, man. But he took it like a man.
Yeah.
But that's great. Yeah, the Bible definitely screams that this world is ordered. This world, the universe, right, is created. It's designed. It shows the fingerprints of God. It's all over, guys. And when you engage in that scientific method and you try to remove as much bias as you can from the outset, I think you definitely come up with conclusions that point to there is a God, right? We talked about design versus evolution in our last show, And we showed that design is an appropriate explanation for the apparent design that we see on a molecular level, right? So the fingerprints of God are shown. So many a bunch of great experiments, a bunch of great questions being asked in the scientific circles. And yeah, we encourage you, especially you youth, if you're watching out there, as you get older and you're going through your studies, become a scientist and engage in some of these and try to answer some of these big questions. And you can definitely be on the forefront of a lot of some answers that haven't been given yet that point to there being a God and God being the best explanation. So definitely encourage you to do that.
I like what Carl Linnaeus said. He said, the study of nature would reveal the divine order of God's creation, and it was the naturalist's task to construct a natural classification that would reveal this order in the universe. Mm. You know, a proper study of the universe will bring us to the conclusion that there is a God, that he has wonderfully created this universe, and he's placed us in the middle of it so that we can know him. It's incredible.
Yeah. Well, audience, that concludes our discussion portion for today. We're going to jump right into our live Q&A. So again, we encourage you to engage in the live chat there. Ask your questions. I'll get them fed over here on my end. And we got one audience member here also. Thank you for joining us. Share the link also, guys, on your social media platforms. This live stream will be available even after the discussion's over. So make sure to share that link and share it with your people that you're interested in having this discussion with. And remember, there's good questions to ask. So I got one question waiting for us in the queue, and it's from the chat room. Thank you, guys. And it says this: it would be great to get a list of these junkyard science, these failed experiments. Do you have any reference that you can share? Or is that something we can share later?
I don't know that there is a list out there. I mean, I could try to compile something.
Yeah. I guess whoever asked that question in the chat room, get with the person that's monitoring the chat room on our end and send them your email address, and we'll make sure to find a reference for you if we can find one. But we'll definitely share the ones that Bunjee shared earlier in the discussion. We'll share those with you for sure. All right. Any other questions from the live chat, guys? One question. I don't think we answered this last week, but it was one of the questions I was going to ask. But it was one objection that a lot of people do ask, and I guess it's kind of scientific in nature, but not. But it goes like this. So, did we ask this? If God is the creator, then who created him? Mm. So I definitely see it's a trope almost. It's just something that's just kind of standard objection.
It's something that every kid asks at some point in time, right? I mean, I see that question pop up in the minds of little kids and college students. So typically in college students who didn't get an answer when they were a kid. But the response is that everything that has a beginning needs a creator. Mm-hmm. God is infinite, right? And we did address it a little bit in the sense that because something does exist, then there has to be something that is infinite.
That's right.
Right. And so we talked about it in that way of because something exists, then there has to be an infinite cause for the existence of finite beings. And since we can't traverse an infinite and go all the way back in time to the first finite beings to exist, we'll never arrive there. We'll never arrive at today from there. Therefore, there has to be an infinite being who has caused all finite beings.
Yep. So, the way my mind thinks, right? I just literally think about it as just a category error, right? When you understand what God is and who God is,
right,
you'll see that type of question in the end, it's like asking that similar question: can God lift a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it?
Yes, he can't.
Yes, he can't. Good answer. But it's one of those questions that when you just think about it a little bit deeper, you say, oh, that question just doesn't make sense because based on who God is, the question is just, it's not reasonable to ask, right? It's just a category error, okay? So we understand who God is, that he's an infinite being, doesn't have a cause. You have to stop somewhere, and God is that somewhere where the causation chain stops. Very good.
John Newberry once asked, can God make a Sasquatch so big that he can't control it? And I said, nah, he can't.
Nah, it's impossible. Is anything impossible for God? So, one other objection that I know that comes up, and maybe we touched on it a little bit, but scientific consensus, right? This is intimidating, especially if somebody brings up to you, well, why is it that so many people are on board with this certain conclusion, right? There's a talk about climate change, talk about evolution, all these kinds of different things, right? That kind of challenge whatever Christian narrative, right?
Yep.
Scientific consensus. How do we address scientific consensus?
First of all, I would say that science has nothing to do with popular vote, right? So everyone in the world can agree with a conclusion and the conclusion be wrong, right? So it's important for us to understand that, science is not based on consensus. It's a search for reality and what is true. It's a search for, finding out the reality, of everything, right? So, I think back to Galileo. Here's one man standing against the consensus of the Catholic Church, right? And thankfully, he was unwilling to just go along with the consensus, and he continued doing his research, and we now know he's right. So, now a lot of people will use that as an argument against the church, which is that's ridiculous, right? So, the fact is that, Galileo was a part of that church. All right. So you just had one scientist, though, who just was unwilling to subscribe to the scientific consensus of the time period. And as a result, he did better science than what had been previously accepted, right? Mm-hmm. So when somebody says, well, the consensus, popular vote, most scientists believe, right? It means nothing, because there's been plenty of times, throughout the history of the world where most scientists embraced something that was false.
Yeah. Yeah, that's literally just, I think most of the time when somebody brings up an objection like this, it's almost used as an intimidation factor.
Right.
You get in line with the consensus, or else you're wrong, or even worse, something worse, right? You're just insulted. And that's a really good point, is that scientific method has nothing to do with consensus. Another similar way that I've actually, it's been brought up to me, where somebody tries to object and say, well, your conclusion hasn't been, like the design argument, right? Your conclusion hasn't been in peer-reviewed journals, or enough peer-reviewed journals, so where I can believe it. And my immediate response was, well, tell me exactly how many peer-reviewed journals it takes for something to basically become valuable, right?
Right. Or true.
Or true, right? So you tell me the number. And usually they don't have a number. What they just know that really they're just arguing against it's a bias that they already hold, and they're just refusing to allow any other contrary evidence in their presence.
You know what has been in many peer-reviewed journals, science journals? Lots of things that have been later disproved.
Yes.
Right? The fact is that, lots of peer-reviewed science journals have included research that was later debunked or disproved, right?
Yeah.
Or shown to be, faulty.
Mm-hmm.
So just because something ends up in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean it's correct or true.
Yeah.
It just means it was accepted at that point in time. But as science, is a tool for discovering truth, which again is a beautiful thing about the scientific method, it does have a self-correcting feature so long as the scientists are engaging in, proper use of the scientific method.
Yeah.
As long as they're willing to slaughter their sacred cows, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I just got hungry, but
starving over here.
But as long as they're willing to slaughter their sacred cows, then they should begin to dismiss what had been previously accepted. But then this reminds me of the fossil discovery in Glen Rose, Texas. Where they found human tracks and dinosaur tracks in the same layer of limestone. Right. So at first they're just kind of like, oh, well, those human tracks were carved. So they dug them all up and they found pressure cracks in the fossil, right? Showing that it was laid down by pressure,
Yeah.
not carved in, right? So then they're like, oh, so okay, this whatever put this footprint in the limestone is walked the same day or within the same week of that dinosaur, right? There was even one track where the human track was inside of the dinosaur track, showing that chances are that human was tracking that dinosaur.
Oh, there's multiple. Yeah.
Right. So at first they're like, oh, these human tracks were carved in it. They dug them up, they x-rayed, they found pressure cracks. They saw, no, it was laid down by pressure. And so then some concluded that, it's amazing because we'd never heard about a dinosaur with human-like feet.
Nice. The missing link.
That was their conclusion, was that there must have been a dinosaur with human-like feet.
Yeah.
Now that's just a scientist who's unwilling to reconcile there's two fossils that don't belong together, and they are.
Yeah.
So,
or when they found, was it soft tissue, right?
They have found soft tissue in dinosaur fossils, which if dinosaurs lived as long ago as they claimed, there should be no soft tissue. It's like the radiocarbon halos in diamonds. It shouldn't exist if diamonds were created when they said they were. Those halos should be gone by now.
Based on it being open system or closed? No, it's a closed system.
Well, it's a closed system. So
whatever it has.
So you're not there's no new carbon being introduced, right? Because it's completely closed. When the diamond's formed, you're not going to be able to introduce new carbon in. So that the carbon that's there, was there when it was formed, right? And if diamonds were created when they claim diamonds were created, then there should be no radiocarbon halos.
Yep.
And yet every diamond has them.
You get that? Anybody want to get a diamond ring? Make sure you get the right one. So yeah, we were talking about scientific consensus. Hopefully we answered that for you. If not, if you need any clarification, let us know in the live chat. Here's another question we got it's a really good one. How do you explain miracles in the light of science? How do you explain miracles in the light of science? So maybe we should probably start off by defining what miracles are, right? I think that would...
Now, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the question.
I think if somebody were objecting, really, they would probably ask it this way. Well, how are miracles possible in the light of science? All the scientific knowledge and the scientific method, really no place for miracles. That might be a way that it's brought up.
Mm-hmm. So if we're approaching this from a materialistic worldview, right, where everything has to be explained by matter, then I would say there is no rational explanation for the supernatural or any reason to expect supernatural things to happen, apart from the fact that nothing blew up and became everything, right?
Except for that one, yeah.
So how do you explain that? And that's what I would ask the materialist who says there are no such thing as miracles. I would say, well, how do you explain this conversation right now? That there was nothing, it blew up, and over time gave way to this conversation. And you're saying that's not a miracle? It's completely miraculous. So if we were to consider like what is the cutoff line of probabilities of what would naturally happen and what would never naturally happen, right? And there is, I forget what the number is, but there is
I forget it, 10 to the something.
Yes, 10 to the something power. But there is, I think it's 10 to the 50th power maybe, that anything with a probability that's smaller than, I think it's 10 to the 50th power, but me and numbers, we don't get along. But so the concept is that anything with a smaller probability of 10 to the whatever power, anything smaller than that would not be naturally, it wouldn't be probable. It would be a supernatural event, or I guess maybe they would say it would not be a natural event, right? Yep. So what is the probability of the entire universe blowing up from nothing? That nothing exploded and became everything. What is the probability of that?
At what point would nothing?
Yeah.
How probable is that? Yeah.
Especially with the scientific law that says from nothing comes.
Yes.
Right. So the very explosion of nothing into everything is against the physical laws. Therefore supernatural.
Yeah.
Because that, this supernatural event is something that is, in conflict with the natural laws and the physical laws, right? So the atheist has to, agree that there's at least one supernatural miracle that existence occurred.
Yeah.
And then beyond that has to explain the miracle of biogenesis, that non-life started breathing.
Yeah, it became life. Yep.
Right. So there's at least two miracles that the atheist
Highly
has to
improbable
explain.
events. Yep.
Yes. So if I'm talking with an atheist and they're asking me to justify miracles, I would turn that around on them and say, you justify your miracles first.
Yeah. You're really attacking their foundational worldview, right? Which is materialism. Which is material. You basically are letting them know materialism is preventing you from understanding and believing in miracles as an explanation, right? And so you're really just attacking them right at the foundation. So that's a really good tactic to use.
But as far as is there a way to use the scientific method to explain miracles? Could the question be understood in that sense?
Sure. Get both sides of it, yeah.
And I would just say that the scientific method is designed to observe, repeat, test, and draw conclusions and make predictions, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that you can do that with a miracle.
Yeah. So this, I've thought about it a bit, and because the miracle for Christianity, right? The one that's most valuable for us is the resurrection of Jesus, right? And so I've definitely seen how historians explain. So history would be one of those scientific disciplines where it's more forensic. You're really trying to figure out, did these things in the past actually happen? And there, if you are a materialist, obviously, then God being the explanation for raising Jesus from the dead is off the table by default because you're a materialist. But when the Christian comes in, or just anybody who is open to non-material causes and material causes, you're really dealing with a full toolbox, as it were. So you actually have more tools at your disposal than the materialist. So you're able to gather more options for your conclusions, right? And so when you're exploring, did Jesus rise from the dead? Was it a miracle or not? Was it a supernatural event or not? As a Christian, I actually have more tools in my toolbox to deal with this question. And so remember, scientific method is, yes, based on repetition and observation, but there is forensic science being done, which you can actually just look for what is the best explanation that describes all of these circumstances. Right. But again, if you're a materialist, you're already just cutting your toolbox in half and you're saying, that's not really useful to me. And that's just not the way, I don't think that's a very smart way to go about it. Okay.
You could also engage in I would even just direct you to Simon Greenleaf and his book, Testimony of the Four Evangelists. Here's a lawyer from Harvard who, my understanding is that he was agnostic, but born Jew. He was a born Jew and chose to be an agnostic, but then was challenged to take on the court case of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and basically cross-examined Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and through the legal, using legal doctrines on how to examine witnesses and consider their credibility, Simon Greenleaf ends up becoming a Christian after cross-examining Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because there was enough credibility in their accounts, and enough eyewitnesses that have been interviewed by Luke, that Simon Greenleaf couldn't deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ just based on the forensic approach of cross-examining eyewitnesses.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good point. All right, let's see. I think we got time for one more question. So it's related to our previous question before the miracle one, which is, if peer-reviewed articles and views are sometimes debunked, why are peer-reviewed journals or peer-reviewed studies elevated so highly? And then part B is, why are theories such as evolution so widely accepted? So a little two-parter there. So the first one, why are peer-reviewed studies elevated so highly, I guess, in culture or society?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is where the groundbreaking research is being revealed, right? So again, we love the scientific method and all the benefits that we receive from it. Computers and microphones and just science is the basis for producing so much of what makes our life better. Medicines and all kinds of awesome stuff, right? So I think that peer-reviewed science journals are important because it gives us basically an overview or even detailed information of the new research that is being accomplished, and so I think that those who are interested in science, will love to go and spend time examining all the new science that is being conducted.
Yeah,
that's my guess. I can't tell you exactly why every single person would read from a scientific journal, but
as far as elevating them so highly,
yeah.
I think that's just a cultural phenomenon where I think we mentioned this at the outset, where it seems like this day and age where you definitely see a lot of dependence on what is the science saying, what is the data saying, and that seems to be the end all be all for a lot of people. They just want to see the science. It's almost promoting a sort of laziness, a lazy approach of, I don't want to think deeply about certain subjects, so if some other people can work hard at that and come up with a conclusion, whatever it is, if it's a peer-reviewed journal, then I'll accept it. And it's almost promoting a sort of intellectual laziness in my estimation, where we shouldn't be so dependent on whatever conclusions are coming out of whatever scientific experiment that we just refuse to think critically. We should always be, again, exercising a healthy skepticism and be humble enough to understand that science is an ongoing discipline. It's an ongoing method. These conclusions, a lot of these conclusions are definitely going to change as technology advances and we're able to become more accurate and precise with our measurements and stuff. Conclusions are always going to change, but I think there's a culture war that we have to fight as Christians for sure in, number one, understanding the scientific method deeper ourselves, and then learning to ask good questions about the experiments that are being done currently and seeing whether or not, are they approaching this from a materialistic standpoint, or do they give way, do they give some leniency for a more supernatural explanation, or just do these conclusions allow for God being the best explanation, right?
Yeah, I think that for some people, and I wouldn't say this about everybody, but I think there are many people who elevate these journals, to the degree that they do, because we're designed to worship. I think we're designed to worship. I think we're designed to, look to a community, and find our place within a community. I think we've been designed this way. And so for some, who embrace scientism, this has become their religion. The journals have become their scriptures, and the scientists have become their priests.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
I'm not saying that's true of everyone that reads science journals, but I think it's true of a lot.
Yeah. And
so then the theory of evolution, it allows them to have this religion. There are some big names in science who have confessed that they embrace evolution because it frees them from feeling like they have to submit to some god.
Was it Richard Dawkins, right? I think he said
Dawkins has said
evolution
Huxley said it.
Allowed me to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
Yep. So there's a lot of materialistic atheistic scientists who embrace the theory of evolution, as empty as it is of evidence. They embrace it because it gives them a scientific basis for rejecting the God of the Bible.
Yeah. And so that should be a call, at least I think, for Christians to be better about doing better science and asking good questions. We Christians should be at the forefront of controlling that conversation and directing that conversation and asking the tough questions so that we will slowly chip away at this what seems to be ingrained in culture, the theory of evolution in schools, in public schools, right? But then just apparently the majority of scientists are supposedly atheists, right? We should be getting more and more Christians who can think critically and be reasonable and have reasonable assumptions and have a good framework and do better science. So I'm talking to you, younger generation. If you're tuning in now, this is high time to, if science is something that interests you, start doing that now. Start asking the questions now and start doing better science today. And that'll lead you into answering some really good questions in the future. Well, with that, audience, I want to end our discussion on the use and abuse of science. I hope that was beneficial for you, profitable for you. I hope you guys learned some new things. And we just encourage you guys again as Christians, know that the Word of God definitely supports science exploration, uniformity of nature, laws of logic, rationality. The Word of God definitely holds it, but the God that we worship, He's the one that grounds it all. And He makes the most sense. He's the reason why we can actually do science at all. And so I hope you take encouragement from that. And I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And I just want to remind you that we do this outreach live stream every other Thursday, at least for the foreseeable future. And we want to invite you to the next one. So 2 Thursdays from now, join us again at 6:30 p.m., calvarysouthAustin.com/live, or our YouTube channel, youtube.com/calvarysouthAustin. And I want to remind you, people that attend Calvary South Austin, we do have our doors open to the church. Join us on Sunday mornings at 9:15 and 11:15 a.m. and on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. We hope to worship with you here. We're practicing the social distancing. We got the hand sanitizer. We got it all, guys, to create a safe environment for the people that have come here to worship. So I hope to see you guys here. Thank you for joining us one last time. It's Ruben and Bunjee. We're signing off. Have a good night.
Peace out.